Welcome to Board Game Nation. My name is Gary Blevins. Thank you so much for watching. I recently had the amazing opportunity to talk with legendary game designer Larry Harris. In our conversation, we talked about his 40-year career where he developed more than 200 games for some of the biggest names in the industry. His most famous game? Axis and Allies. Since the original game came out in 1984, it has spawned more than 20 spin-offs and updates, 3 of which were inducted into the Adventure Board Game Hall of Fame in 1996. But as much as I admired his professional career, I was also curious about Larry Harris as a person. I asked him what his inspiration was for getting into historical gaming. And honestly, this was my favorite part of the whole interview. Let's check it out. I understand that your inspiration for getting into historical gaming and Axis and Allies and what was originally called 1942 comes from a fairly personal place, and I wonder if I can ask you about that.
I think you're probably referring to my father's World War II diary that I discovered. Is that? Yeah. Imagine I don't know, remember, 9, 10, something like this. I find this diary. And he's an artist. My father was a bit of an artist, so there was all these little images as well as the wording. And I'm reading about this guy, and it's my father, and he's on this most amazing adventure. I mean, he's with the National Guard down in Florida, and the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and he's one of the first people to be sent overseas because he's already in the National Guard. So they linked up a National Guard unit from Tennessee, I think that's where you're from, and New England. And they called it the 43rd Infantry Division, and they sent them immediately, without escort, on a troop ship to Guadalcanal to help the Marines there. And 5,000 guys. And they were pulling into an Allied harbor, and they ran into 2 mines. Sank in a matter of minutes. 5,000 guys got off. There was only 3 casualties, but they were shipwrecked. And from there, then they recovered from that. But that was just the beginning of his adventure. Ships sunk from under him, and so on. And then they're moving up through the Solomon Islands, fighting the Japanese there in the jungle early on when. Really, the United States didn't have air dominance, or it was a rough time in the early war, as we all know, or we should know. And from there, he went to New Guinea and on to the Philippine Islands. He was bombed by Mitsubishi bombers. He stood off banzai charges. In the Philippines, they rushed through the lines, went 6 miles behind the lines, and set up a battalion-sized observation post behind enemy lines, and the Japanese were not happy that they were there. They were attacked every night, and just an amazing story. And then finally he comes home and has me. so that was my introduction to World War II, which it gave me an appreciation for what was history, the notion of history. It all stemmed from that. So that was my inspiration, yes.
Well, that's amazing. That sounds like you should be selling the movie rights.
It goes into amazing things, like his best friend from Tennessee, Frank Parks, in case you know him.
It's my neighbor. He lives right next
door. Yeah, well.
Frank Parks, the 2 of them were foxhole buddies. They went through the whole war together. And in the last days, the closing days of 45 in the Philippines, he was shot and killed while my father was manning the company radio. He was out in the field with this, a recon unit, and got killed. And big loss, big story. It would have made an amazing movie. They went to New Zealand together after fighting through the Solomons. They went to New Zealand, and both of them young guys, 18, 19 years old, discovering this universe of New Zealand and the paradise it represented after they had just been not knowing if they were going to live for another 5 minutes from a battle zone. And then they find themselves in paradise, and he writes about that. And it would have made a great movie. I really think it would have made a great movie. Who knows? Maybe it will be a great movie.
So that's amazing, and I'm always fascinated by, to me, like, history is not about, dates and places and times. It's about the people, right? It's about the story that the people came away with or didn't, as the case may be. So I'm always fascinated by that, and so I appreciate you sharing that with us. So speaking of your time in the service, I understand you were in the United States Army in the late 60s, early 70s, and I'm curious if your time in the service changed how you viewed history of the U.S. or globally, and how that might have affected your game theory and your approach to game design.
Actually, it wasn't so much the military. I was already interested in history when I got into the military, but my interest in history, along with the diary and so on, or politics and so on, started while I lived in Iran for, interestingly enough, my father was in the military, so I was an Army brat, and one of our assignments was Iran in the 60s. I arrived in 1960, and believe me, Iran was a third world country, like really amazing. And so we lived outside of Tehran, for about 10 miles outside of Tehran. Loved it, and I saw the people under this Shah at that time, and I heard rumors of riots in the streets, and saw this. We were out on a hunting trip. I was with my father, and we were hunting for ibex in the mountains outside of Tehran, and we had it was a group of us. I was 12, 13 years old. I had an M1 rifle with me to shoot on ibex, if you can imagine, and along with the rest of the hunting party. And it was a campfire moment at late that night, and there was an Iranian soldier assigned to us who was our translator and so on. And we were telling jokes, and it was all about Kennedy and politics back then. And it was jokes being exchanged around a campfire. And what I remembered, or what shocked me, was the Iranian translator telling us, "It must be wonderful to be able to laugh about your president." And whereas, of course, the message was that he could not say anything about his Shah or that kind of government. And all these guys who were having a real good time and laughing and raising hell with each other suddenly just stopped, and there was this awkward silence, and it made an impact on me, if no one else, I could tell you that. And that made me conscious of it. And then later, back to your original question there, I went to Paris, Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe shape. That was after being in the 82nd. Don't ask me how that happened. And so I find myself in Paris, and NATO is leaving, NATO is leaving France because de Gaulle wanted us out, and so I'm arriving just as everybody's leaving, and they're all moving to Mons, Belgium, and I spent the whole summer in Paris, just waiting for further follow-up orders.
There's worse ways to spend a summer than the late 60s in France.
But while I was there, I went to Normandy. I checked out the battlefields of Normandy. I visited Verdun. I took advantage. I was already, as I said, historically conscious, or conscious of history. And so the military gave me an opportunity to touch and be next to history. For example, ultimately I ended up in Mons, Belgium, where NATO headquarters ended up, shape. And that was only 30 miles from Waterloo, so I spent a lot of time over at the Waterloo Museum and battlefield there. So again, the military offered me an opportunity to live and be in Europe, where I could actually touch this stuff and be around it. I spent a night in an off-limits area of Verdun. The reason why it's off-limits was because there was all kinds of still unexploded ordnance all over the place, so they didn't want anybody in there. That didn't stop me, their little barbed wire fence. I went under it and spent the night in this forest, this pine forest. What they did was the place was so destroyed and so unable to be recuperated, they just flew airplanes over it and dropped pine cones all over the place to grow back a forest. I went into that forest. I'm telling you, there are ghosts. And there are ghosts. I heard, smelt, felt that battlefield all around me that night. I was by myself in that place. It was creepy. Verdun was. I did a game called 1914, Axe Knowledge 1914, and Verdun was. I wrote about Verdun in that, and it was a sad place, and the only way you could really experience that was to be there and to smell it. I'm sorry, just going off on it.
Yeah, not at all. No, that's great. I tell you, I think that we could probably just do 2 hours of stories of summer in Paris.
So what do we have? This old guy with his reminiscing here?
No. Honestly, it's these stories that I think are so important because without them, we don't have any context, right? Like, without having been there, right? Without having touched it, or and understood what it meant, right? Like, that's what makes it not just a date and a point on a map, right? It's the understanding that,
for sure,
those were real people and this was a real thing that happened. So yeah, no, I appreciate that. Again, a big thank you to Larry Harris for taking the time to sit down and talk with us. If you want to see more from that interview, click here. If you're ready to watch the whole thing, here's your link. And if you want to see everything going on with Board Game Nation, click here to subscribe. Again, my name is Gary Blevins. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.